I'm Dr. Berkson, and I want to welcome you to tonight's discussion, which is about a trilogy: autoimmune diseases, hormones, and endocrine disruption. What you're really going to ask yourself, whether you're a practitioner or a patient, is why are my physicians, like OBGYN docs and hormone docs, not discussing this? It's a huge issue. I want to thank Biotics for sponsoring this talk, and they also allowed me to sponsor my brand new products, Receptor Detox, Hormone Balance and Protect, which were based on my working with Elwood Jensen and Yanaki Gustafsson. They discovered the first two receptors. I worked with them at Tulane, and they said that hormones are about receptor functionality, and our dirty planet is assaulting that. And some of the outcome happens to be autoimmune diseases. We think of endocrine disruption as mainly causing hormone issues. So today we're going to merge the concept of hormones, autoimmune diseases, and endocrine disruption, and then what we can do about it if we can get into that. Going to the next slide. So first of all, autoimmune diseases are on the increase. How do we know that? Well, one of the biggest autoimmune antibodies to identify if there's an autoimmune disease are anti-nuclear antibodies. They're called anti-nuclear because in the nucleus of the cell, where most of the Star Trekian directives on the spaceship of the cell are working, antibodies can actually attack the nucleus. So many of us have autoantibodies, but it's really only in the amount that we have them that then says our body is really starting to attack our own tissues, and anti-nuclear antibodies can give you an idea of that. The presence of a large number of them can indicate a spectrum of autoimmune disease, but it's basically saying, hey, your body is under attack. So in lupus, scleroderma, Sjögren's syndrome, polymyositis, Wernicke's granulomatosis, Hashimoto's, multiple sclerosis, many patients with those will have anti-nuclear antibodies. So they did a study tracking the incidence of anti-nuclear antibodies over the past 50 years. And they were really able to show that there's more and more in American bodies, kids and adults alike, of anti-nuclear antibodies. So more of us are at war with our own bodies. This is now well established. This came out of the NIH. This should be headline news as to why this is happening, but you and I all know that this isn't the case. So the thing with medicine is it offers a lot of life-saving things and some prescriptions that you need, but at the same time, you got to save yourself from it because it can also be harmful. Autoimmune is on the rise. I'm not going to go through every single slide. There's lots of slides in here. When you get a PDF of this from the wonderful American Council on Nutrition that I love so near and dear, and Jesse does a phenomenal job, they are going to make all this available to you. So this is kind of a booklet that you could put together, pass out to your patients, or read when you're in the bathroom and you have nothing else to read about this link of hormones, autoimmunity, and endocrine disruption. So autoimmunity is on the rise. Celiac disease is one of the most identified. And I really think with all the gluten awareness, we're just testing for it more. But RA, type 1 diabetes, MS, they're all on the rise, and that's clear cut. But you have to think of autoimmune diseases as a continuum. It takes a really long time to get diagnosed, and it usually means you've already had some tissue damage by the time you do get diagnosis. And once you get one autoimmune disease, you usually end up, as time goes down the road, we have a road here, you usually start showing up with more autoimmune diseases. If you have a patient that's over 55 years old, you always want to say when they're going in for their colonoscopic imaging, you ought to ask the doctor to do some intestinal biopsies on you. That's the only way to diagnose microscopic colitis, which is a autoimmune disease of the gut wall that is very common in the elderly. It's only diagnosed with that. I tell all my patients to get that. But why would that be? Why do you, if you have one autoimmune disease, you're more apt to get a bunch more? That's because the root cause of what's dealing with this autoimmune, what's causing it and how to fix it. The end of the slides talk about how to fix it. The beginning of it talks about the problems. And in the middle, we talk about the role of hormones in endocrine disruption. So the immune system has all kinds of tissues, but it's intimately related with the hormonal system. In fact, I've spoken at the ACA on the role of the hormone system and the immune system, but so much so that there are a lot of people saying, why don't we call toxicology now immunotoxicology? But many environmental pollutants like organochlorines, pesticides, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, all which are endocrine disruptors, can either lead to a problem with the immune system because the immune system has receptors for hormones on Treg cells, on B cells, T cells, antibodies. You have receptors wherever there's receptor, a hormone can play a role. If an endocrine disruptor competitively inhibits and sits on that same receptor, you might not get the proper stimulus to the immune system. So you can have underactive, or with autoimmune disease, which is basically the immune system overactive on overdrive. So you can have issues in your tissues with hormones, making your immune system not perform well enough or perform way too much, where it starts attacking even your own tissues. So low-level exposure to pollutants in the general population sensitizes organisms to the development of these pathologies, weakening the immune system and theoretically increasing also as a major contributor of autoimmune diseases. Thus, one of the reasons we need to clear off our receptors and keep our hormones well, and this is no small thing. So endocrine disruptors are a group of chemicals that could be natural compounds. So some people say that soy is an endocrine disruptor because it sits on receptors. I don't necessarily agree, but you can have natural endocrine disrupting compounds, or you can have synthetic chemicals that basically are man-made to give us convenience of today's contemporary life. They can block a normal hormone signal. They can sit in on the receptor and not let your own hormone get in. They can amplify the signal. They can alter the signal. They can alter how we know that hormones are broken down into metabolites that each have their own action. If you are sitting in a room and you're in a brand new home that was just built and you're inhaling lots of a mixture of outgassing chemicals, that can alter the metabolites and the way that they function in your body. If you sit in front of a computer more than 4 or 5 hours a day, the Women's Health Initiative did a study on sitting and what happens to hormone metabolites. So sitting is also an endocrine disruptor if we do it long enough, which many of our society are doing. But basically, endocrine disruptors can make your hormones not work that well, but they have time periods of the most sensitivity, which are early on in life. The egg, the sperm, the placenta, mother's milk, and the first few years of a baby's life. These matter into the fertility and into the immune capability and whether that offspring grows up to have autoimmune diseases or not. The paper came out just last week. If you read my Substack, which I write in every morning, it's now been shown that young girls in the United States, 8 years old and up, have a lot more male hormones. In fact, I found an article that stated this issue in 1982, but we're still writing about it right now in 2022. And at the same time, we're seeing males with much less testosterone. You think there's gender fluidity? If you just look at hormones, that's part of it, but hormones play a role in immune competence. So this is having ramifications. EDCs, most sensitive time, the egg, they love fat. They love fat like we all love fat. So the egg is basically made of fat. The sperm is made of fat. The placenta is made of fat. Breast milk is mainly fat. If a mother hasn't detoxed and taken care of herself, she downloads 80% of her lifetime exposure to endocrine disrupting pollutants into a baby in the first few months of life. I wrote about this extensively in Hormone Deception. The biggest issue is if a woman wears perfumes, which are high in phthalates, if she eats processed food, if she eats string cheese, which is shrunk in any food that's in pre-shrunk plastic, which of course is so many foods. I hyperventilate when I walk into Trader Joe's because almost everything in the entire store is in plastic, but that plastic gets, if you're pregnant or you haven't yet been pregnant, you're walking around with some eggs and your wannabe partner is walking around with some sperm, you're getting that into yourself. And then when the fetus starts to develop, that is passed on even with no more exposure to the next few generations. Therein lies the big rub of endocrine disruption if we don't figure out a way to remediate and stop it in its tracks. It's what we call transgenerational. It especially, for example, affects stem cells of fat cells. We know it's harder to lose weight for many of us in 2022 than it was in 1982 because the fat cells that we're birthing are nastier and larger and more resistant to weight loss measures. It could just be that my mother was exposed, as most of you know, to diethylstilbestrol. All the downstream generations, the daughters, the granddaughters, and the great-granddaughters have issues with keeping weight off because it epigenetically altered from that one exposure. Therein lies some of the other conundrum of endocrine disruption. EDCs increase the risk of autoimmune disease. So because we're now linking the two together, parents can pass these effects on to the next generation. So your kids are more vulnerable to the incidence of Hashimoto's disease, to multiple sclerosis, to things that you really don't want your beloved child or your patients to have. So that's because EDCs love fat. And remember, the brain is mainly made up of fat. So when the baby is developing its brain, any endocrine disrupting compound that gets into the body can get into that developing brain and make epigenetic changes such as altering IQ. We see this with lead. Lead is an endocrine disruptor and there's no level of it that's safe, and lead can alter. I talk about this extensively in Hormone Deception, and there was a wonderful book written completely about this called The Bell Curve. And they show that a small amount of lead can change your IQ point 1 or 2 points, which can change the trajectory of your life. So it really makes a big difference for us all now to get on the same page to try and minimize exposure. So there can be a continuum. A young male eats highly processed food, sits in a module at work, it's outgassing with what all kinds of chemicals. You know, they've got cheap so the fake wood floor that's kind of cheap, that's off-gassing stuff. That's all getting into the body of the person who's sitting at that module hours a day. Then it gets into the sperm, then it gets into the placenta. Then the baby is exposed to these EDCs. This can change the gene expression. And then you can start having an increased incidence of autonuclear antibodies and a tendency of increased incidence to autoimmune disease. Harvard came out with a paper. I've got all these citations here for you to look on your own, but they basically said that it's all about chemicals in the increased. So there's an increased incidence of autoimmunity overlapping with the increased incidence of contemporized life with synthetic materials. They said this suggests a role for environmental factors such as endocrine disrupting compounds. This is from this Harvard article, and they go into depth with their theories about how endocrine disruption can contribute to many different autoimmune illnesses. Of course, I wrote one of the very first books on this, and based on this book, which was one of the breakthrough books on endocrine disruption, I was invited to work with William Toscano and John McLaughlin. William went on to become the academic dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. They worked very closely with Elwood Jensen, who was the first guy to discover the very first estrogen receptor. The first talk he ever gave, there were only 3 people in the audience, and his postdoc advisor said, "You better get a part-time job as a janitor or something," because no one believed in the way that hormones work. For some reason, from the very beginning of hormones, they've been a rabbit hole in medicine with a lot of difficulty to push the understanding with the people who really get it to be translated into the clinical trenches. I also worked there with Yanaki Gustafsson, and the last several conferences called hormone conferences that we put on. They sounded naturopathic because nutrition has so much to do with how hormones deliver their messages. But endocrine disruptors are really the weapons of mass destruction. In January 1917, the Huffington Post and Harvard got together to talk about the three major threats against humanity. This is the first one, of course, is nuclear war, and the second one is global warming, but the third is endocrine disruption, because it is increasing the incidence of infertility. The big debate at Tulane was where they'll be gender bending, and now Harvard is posing the fact, are they contributing to this absolutely alarming rise of autoimmune disease? So what the heck? Endocrine disruptors affect gene expression. Here's Gene Kelly. I'm so old, nobody even knows who Gene Kelly is anymore at most of my lectures, but he was a dancer, so he was expressive, so I put his name next to gene expression. The whole point of gene expression is you take the archived information, like Google, the headquarters of Google, and it wants to they have the directives of how cells should direct your health, and you get this from your mom and your dad, and this is mankind's lineage, how the instructions that you got from your mom and dad actually get laid down to all of your cells. So the archival information has to be translated and faxed to your cells to tell them what to do. That's gene expression. Well, endocrine disruption can alter this genetic expression so that your cells get the wrong signals, including your immune cells. We know that signaling, so just when I talk about signaling, here's a receptor, a really kind of simplistic picture, and this could be estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. It's referred to as a ligand. This is the basic lock and key. This is called genomic signaling, because as this settles on in and shimmies in space, the genetic information is downloaded into the genes of the cell. So it's called genomic signaling. And there's also instantaneous transmembranous signaling that takes place right on the membrane of cells. It's much more instantaneous, so it's called non-genomic. Turns out that endocrine disruption can influence both genomic and non-genomic signaling, which is one of the reasons it's being looked at as an inducer of an increased incidence of autoimmune disease. But the receptor is where the functionality of the hormone health is where it's all at. That's what the guys that I worked with in Tulane said. So if you want to start helping autoimmune disease, you got to get some of the endocrine disruptors out of the body and make the hormones start working healthfully. Whether you can write scripts for hormones or not write scripts for hormones, you got to figure out a way to make these receptors, which are flush with nutrients, more available to hormone health and get hormones balanced. And very few physicians know how to do this, since at medical schools and naturopathic schools, hormones are taught that they drive cancer. They're not really taught that they do all of these amazing things that we're learning. So we have a room for, no matter what practitioner or licensure you come from, for you to help people take better care of their hormones. Hormones, when they're disrupted, endocrine disruption can affect hormone, brain, gut crosstalk, and we're going to go into that depth. Just to remind you, this is a receptor. So Tom Bishop took this computerized, it was one of the very first computerized images of how the heck a receptor works, and Tom Bishop gave this to me. So you can see that it's very malleable, and here's a molecule of estrogen. And because it's so malleable, it's wiry, it can expand. You can stuff a lot of things like cadmium from cigarette smoke, lead that's outgassing from old sheetrock, flame retardants that's coming from fish flesh, microplastics that's coming from sea salt. All of that can nestle on into these receptors and either block estrogen getting in here, or estrogen getting in here and then signaling your Treg cells, your antibodies in your immune system to work healthfully. This is estradiol, and you can see that diethylstilbestrol, the drug my mom was given, and this is DDT. And bisphenol A is the grand dam of endocrine disruptors. You really want to figure out a way to try and clear bisphenol A out of autoimmune patients' life and out of your own life. It's the one that has the most literature on it as being disruptive on the immune system and immunocompetence, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it also lodges in the placenta and gets downloaded from mom to baby in breast milk. So if you want to help people with chronic autoimmune diseases, you want to figure out a way to minimize plastic, clean up their lives, have a $50 Berkey shower filter on the shower, because you get most of your exposure from the water that's not filtered from your shower. You much more exposure in a 10-minute shower than what you can drink of water all day long. So that is a big part of healing autoimmune disease. We know that endocrine disruptors are contributing to the obesity epidemic, changing of reproductive milestones of life, how we're hardwired to give birth. So our ages of menarche and menopause, perimenopause, they're changing. Women have more testosterone, men have less. That's a big change that's never been seen before. Methylation issues. Endocrine disruptors can sit on methylation receptors and not allow methylation to occur. And of course, now the whole talk is about the link with endocrine disruptors and autoimmune disease. So one of the other things that you're going to learn is when endocrine disruptors can block a hormonal signal, one of the big aspects of autoimmune disease that is not appreciated is that the root cause is an unwell gut. If the gut is unwell and the wall is excessively leaky, then debris goes into the bloodstream. This puts the immune system on alert that enemy debris has entered the body, and the immune system starts to fight and often can't turn that fight off. Progesterone helps keep the gut less leaky. It upregulates sticky adhesive proteins. So we want progesterone in people with autoimmune disease. You don't hear about this, and it's not very well known in regular medical circles. The old thinking was if you don't have a uterus, you really don't need progesterone because it's only good to decrease excessive estrogen signaling at the lining of the uterus. We know that the gut wall is a huge part of treating people with autoimmune disease, and on the gut wall are receptors for every single hormone. And in particular, from your mouth, which is north, to your south, you have secretory IgA, which licks what comes into your body and informs your immune system, whether it's friend or foe. It is the most abundant immunoglobulin that is trying to protect you from the outside as things come into your inside. Well, your secretory IgA is highly influenced by testosterone. That's why men get much less autoimmune diseases than women, because they have more secretory IgA, because they have more testosterone. But in today's endocrine disrupted planet, we have young girls with more testosterone and young boys with less testosterone. With less testosterone, they're not getting the same licking of what comes into the body to inform the immune system in a sensible and healthy manner. And you might think, well, if girls are getting more testosterone, why are they having more autoimmune diseases? Because it's not natural for them to have that increased androgen load that we're seeing. Bisphenol A, as I said, it's been the most characterized endocrine disruptor, and by all kinds of estimates, they say when they test urine of Americans that 93% of Americans have detectable bisphenol A in their urine. But the big deal is that when you look, there was a Cedars-Sinai study where they looked at amniocentesis of a group of young, healthy American women, and almost every single woman who was about to give birth, they were testing her amniotic fluid that the baby is floating in. The majority of them had at least 130 chemicals, almost all of them, which are endocrine disruptors. If you don't think that going for green pregnancies and the concept of the nuclear family, picking your mate, cleaning and detoxing together, getting your own health well. The baby has no thyroid for the first trimester of pregnancy. It leans on its mom's thyroid. If its mom's thyroid isn't healthy, all of these things that you could do, prenatal nutrition is unbelievable, because the OB/GYN docs are not picking this up to really go after this concept of green pregnancy, which we need to do because we're birthing sicker and sicker kids. And in the few non-well controlled studies out of New Zealand, where they did try and detox pregnant, soon to be moms and dads of a lot of chemicals and track the children born to them, it appears as though there's a decreased significant incidence of on the spectrum ADHD and autoimmune diseases, because a lot of them are coming from preconceptual exposure. It doesn't mean that you can't do much right where a patient walks in the door, but the ideal thing is to try, and I hope somebody takes me up on this gauntlet. I do have at my website, drlindsayberkson.com, in the store, something called Green Pregnancies. And I put together this whole thing that you could have your patients come in and teach them about this. So autoimmune exposure to phenols is a potential risk. They're linking in animal models, lupus to long-term BPA exposure, colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. But if you go and deal with a hematologist, rheumatologist, you're not going to hear this from them, because they diagnose you and put you on the meds that they know, and they're not of the mindset to look at the cause, because many of these things, in my experience now clinically, if you can go back to the cause and clean up the gut and decrease the inflammation in the body, you can reverse even long-standing autoimmune diseases. If you talk to most endocrinologists, they'll say, why measure the antibodies of the thyroid? They're not going to come down. But in our patients, where you deal with the gut, reduce inflammatory foods, and take your steps to really heal, what happens? Those antibodies come down and patients heal. That's the whole story. Now, ethinyl estradiol so most birth control pills are made up of an estrogen and a progestin, and the estrogen's not our normal estrogen. It's ethinyl estradiol. It's a synthetic estrogen. And usually the progestin, which is very confusing because they also use the word progesterone, are synthetic progestins. So much so that at Tulane, when we were testing chemicals to see if they were endocrine disruptors, we used diethylstilbestrol as a control, and we used ethinyl estradiol as a control. There is quite a bit of literature showing that girls with the right genetic background exposed to ethinyl estradiol will get inflammatory bowel disease. Here is an endocrine disruptor causing an autoimmune disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, recurrent ongoing diverticulitis. These are now considered really autoimmune diseases. And I give a 1-hour talk on this, which if you were in my membership, we have that archived. And I remember giving this talk once at A4M, and the amount of literature substantiating this is vast, and it spans several decades. And the doctors were flabbergasted. They said, how could millions of women be getting birth control pills and none of us know any of these articles and research? I said, welcome to my world. How to go in this business and surf through all this data and not get crazy. So the most common autoimmune disease is Hashimoto's, and it basically is the cause of many types of hypothyroid cases in the United States. Not all, but many types. So this gives you a lot of what's going on with the thought of that. So if you have someone with hypothyroidism, you want to figure out, you want to reduce their exposure to endocrine disruptors, and you want to figure out how to address their gut, which we'll go into a little bit more soon. And you want to figure out a way to caretake their hormones. So even if they have continued exposure, because it's impossible to avoid all exposure, that they have enough minerals on board and receptor detoxifying elements so that they won't take those toxic immune daunting components in. But there are also many thyroid disruptors. I interviewed on my podcast Barbara Demanu, who came from the Sorbonne scientist and wrote a book called The Toxic Cocktail. Her whole career is about how the thyroid is so vulnerable to endocrine disruption. In fact, Dr. Brownstein says that up to 60 to 75% of his patients have low thyroid because of endocrine disruptors. And several chemicals known to be thyroid disrupting compounds. They now have a new term for it, THDCS. Instead of EDCs for endocrine disrupting compounds, they have THDCs for thyroid disrupting compounds, have been shown to interact with virtually all elements of thyroid homeostasis. So you can go through this on your own, but every which way that thyroid functions, chemicals can attack every which way. So even though you're on Synthroid, or even though you're taking a glandular natural product, if you are not in some way constantly detoxing the stuff out of yourself, all of these components that make your hormone system work are under attack, and your hormone system is intimately related to your immune response to the world outside of you. This is not only of theoretical importance, as the reported plasma concentrations of THDCs in human plasma fell well within the range of reported in vitro effect concentrations. So in the test tube, in vitro are tests in the lab. And in tests in the lab, when they reach a level that causes, if it's in the amniotic fluid, it's going to affect offspring, they have found that thyroid disruptors are in the amniotic fluid and in our environment. So a lot of issues with fetal formation, organogenesis, and brain development and emotional development. These thyroid and other endocrine disruptors affect the higher executive functioning of the brain, but we're not really focusing on that right now. This paper showed that many papers evaluate the effect of the environment that can lead to thyroid autoimmunity, and they were able to come up with just organochlorines, pesticides, PCB, being near aluminum foundries or eating a lot of food, canned food, the exposure of mercury in various office workers, or swordfish. A lot of people think fish is healthy, so they'll eat swordfish, which is high in mercury. I work now part-time in Naples, Florida. Grouper is advertised everywhere. It concentrates mercury more than any other chemical. And so we get a patient in with autoimmune disease. The first thing we got to do is get them off fish for now, because fish used to be a great food, used to be a superfood. But right now, fish is filled with endocrine disrupting compounds. You can measure vanadium in a hair analysis because it inflames thyrocytes. And what we do know, and there's an article here, this was called Endocrine Disruptors and Thyroid Immunity. There's an article that shows if you give high dose fatty acids, and that's one of the things, we'll go through the hierarchy of what we do to heal autoimmune disease. We give a lot of healthy fish oil. That fish oil by doctors' lines has been processed so that there isn't any heavy metal or mercury in them. And also myo-inositol is an anti-endocrine disrupting fighter, and so is selenium. The big deal is that the more minerals you have in your body and the more botanicals that have the action of clawing out toxins, even if you're exposed, the toxins don't stay in you, they get rinsed out through you much more quickly. That's why every day you want to be taking something, whether it's my products or something else, to figure out a way that even you can't stop all the exposure in your patient or your family and yourself, but you want to be able to make sure that it has the minimal negative effect. So you want minerals. The more minerals you have, the less heavy metals can bind. You want high dose quality fish oil, and you're going to want botanicals like cilantro and apigenin from celery and milk thistle, not just for its liver action, but for its anti-endocrine disrupting compound action. But we can use nutrition that, even though we're continually being exposed, it can minimize the issues of that exposure. Ideally, with pregnancy, you want to work with a patient pre-conception, especially if autoimmune diseases run in that family, but especially during pregnancy and lactation, you want to figure out a way to minimize that exposure. And of course, I did that in this book. Type 1 diabetes, they're looking at why are we seeing such an increase in type 1 diabetes? The beta cells that make insulin are extremely vulnerable to endocrine disruption. They are all covered by oxytocin receptors. And oxytocin has a lot to do with blood sugar maintenance. The beta cells and the alpha cells, both the beta and alpha cells are covered by oxytocin. And oxytocin, it turns out, is extremely vulnerable to endocrine disruption. So you want to keep your hormones healthier as they get damaged. One of the causes of type 1 diabetes, and of course people are theorizing what that is exposure to endocrine disruptors, especially to oxytocin. What's one of the biggest oxytocin endocrine disruptors is bisphenol A that we were just talking about. And some forward-thinking gynecologists say, hey, 60% of births in the United States, the woman is given Pitocin. It is not a synthetic oxytocin, but it's given just as an IV, and normal oxytocin is pulsed through the body. Nature never does anything without a perfectly great reason, and pulsing oxytocin hormone caretakes oxytocin receptors. But when oxytocin is given in one continuous flush, because it's also a contractile hormone to help the woman's uterus contract, then there's a lot of discussion. Is this disrupting for life unless we figure out a way to fix it, which is what I try and work on all the time, is how to fix these hormonal glitches. Is this part of the cause of kids being so unruly, so not behaving well, not wanting to be generous of spirit, not wanting to be communal, not wanting to have follow through with work? Oxytocin is that hormone that makes you a human as part of a big community. So as we disrupt these hormones, we're looking at autoimmunity. We could also be looking at social interactions. I mentioned before about the role in the obesity epidemic. Also, there's a huge inner role between the biome and autoimmunity, and hormones influence the biome and the biome influence hormones. So the biome, we used to think of it as just in the large colon and small colon, but you have nooks and crannies all throughout your body, and they all send out protein signals that communicate with each other. So you basically, Eckhart Tolle used to say, we've got the fear body, the pain body, but we've also got the biome body. And keeping your biome body healthier reduces the issue with autoimmunity, and it goes hand in hand with hormones. The healthier your secretory IgA, which is what licks that immunoglobulin that lines from your nose, from your north to your south, that helps maintain a healthy biome. And the biome, actually, a healthy biome produces androgens. This is the work of Michael Baker at the University of Southern California. It actually produces male hormones to help keep the secretory IgA working well, to help ward off any autoimmune cascade effect. Endocrine disruptors are known to paralyze the biome. So you have a biome body, and endocrine disruptors can assault it, and that makes you more prone to autoimmune disease. So part of autoimmunity is healing the gut wall, healing digestion, and assessing biomes and trying to get biomes healthy. Since the gut starts in the nose, if someone has chronic a history of recurrent sinusitis and chronic nasal congestion, to really get that autoimmune disease well, because your gut starts in your nose, you might have to do some nebulizing with some hydrogen peroxide and saline water and colloidal silver or biocidin or whatever you put in it. You have to have biome consciousness of the biome body and understand that they work hand in hand with hormones. So testosterone levels in men have declined over the last 2 years. And what's really shocking is it's age independent. So I help a new low T center here in Austin with a surgeon and a bunch of urologists, and they opened up the first stores about 10 years ago. And they thought who would come marching in, but mostly erectile dysfunctional older gents. But instead, they had all these young guys coming in, not wanting super orgasms, but saying, I can't even, I just can't even. And we know that as the T goes down, the secretory IgA that protects and licks what comes in goes down. The mutuality between the biome and the secretory IgA is dented, and then we're more at risk for autoimmune disease. Breast cancer has a biome, and we're looking at that. I'm going to move through these a little bit more. Infertility, they're now saying that the placenta has a biome, and there can be a lot of endocrine disruptors within the placenta of tissue that contribute to autoimmune disease. I'm going to, if bisphenol A is highly linked for young girls of going into menarche, starting to menstruate earlier than ever. I was at one ACOG meeting where they were talking about a growing body of young women going to perimenopause in their later 20s. Women who do that, where they don't have the right hormones, they're much more at risk of autoimmune disease. And so let's just take a little dive. What exactly is autoimmune disease? It's when the body starts to attack itself with autoantibodies, but they're basically pathological. But I'd like you to read all this on your own. You can go more into it. Here's the secretory IgA that I was talking about, which is the largest immune globulin you have as your first line of defense. And it is important to have this working right to avoid getting autoimmune disease or to heal it. And it's dependent on testosterone, on androgen health. Immunoglobulin A, this is a little bit more about it. Interestingly enough, all forms of immunoglobulin A are glycolysated. And that means, according to this glycolization in its role, they can be aberrantly, if you consume too many sugars or foods that turn into sugars like alcohol, you can make your immunoglobulins get drunk and stupid with being sugary and bloated, and they don't function well. So what should lick and decipher if it's friend or foe can't even barely open its mouth. So interestingly enough, there's a role of the endocrine disruption and the highly processed diet that play a role into autoimmunity. So we have endocrine disruptors and processed sugars contributing together to the increased incidence of autoimmune disease. I have so many patients, I'm sure you do too, that they've been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and put on, most of them now, biologics, and never discuss diet. They don't think really diet has much to do with any of this. It's kind of shocking. I know we have a local acupuncture college here with a woman who had very severe rheumatoid arthritis, very severe autoimmune disease, where she was in a wheelchair for years. And at that time, they used methotrexate, which was highly linked after 10 years of use to an increased incidence of brain tumors like glioblastoma. So she bumped into somebody who told her about gluten and avoiding gluten and taking high dose fish oil and healing her gut and avoiding processed sugars and getting acupuncture. And she has been out of a wheelchair now for 20 years, totally healthy, normal, but that's not what you hear from typical mainstream docs that you go to. And she bought this acupuncture school here with 2 other people and opened it because of her own personal experience. So autoimmune diseases can be reversed, but you've got to figure out how they come about, the root cause of what went wrong, and then fix that and give it the best try that you can. Here's just some articles on testosterone in the gut. So I'd like you to read these more on your own. And it's one of the reasons you need testosterone to make secretory IgA to decrease your incidence of autoimmune disease. Winners have more testosterone. People who work out at the gym have more testosterone. People who make love more frequently, University of Georgia studies have shown, have more testosterone. Nature gives us more testosterone when we exert, when we hug, when we intermingle, because it's important. So I hate to see it being taught that women shouldn't be put on testosterone replacement as they age, especially as you age, you're more prone to more autoimmune diseases. You just don't want more testosterone than you need. So autoimmune diseases are more frequent in females. There's 159 of them, and 158 of them happen more commonly in women. And that's because of testosterone. So you always want to measure testosterone in any autoimmune patient. You want to measure free. The free testosterone is the real deal because the total doesn't tell you how much can signal. So you want the free to be somewhere in the high normal range. And also you have to measure sex hormone binding globulin. That's a binding protein. And if it's really elevated, which it can elevate with stress and with age and with a whole laundry list of things, the higher it is, no matter how great your level of testosterone is, the less your secretory IgA has access to it. High binding protein, sex hormone binding protein, lowers our ability to use the testosterone that we have. So you got to have a doctor that knows to order these things so you know really the bigger picture. So every autoimmune patient, you should know the total and the free testosterone. You should order sex hormone binding globulin, and you should look at all the other hormones, and you should try and do an assessment of their exposure from the minute they wake up in the morning till they go to bed to try and reduce exposures to things that keep stressing out the immune system and give them the nutrients that sit inside hormone signals and figure out a way to clean off those receptors and fill them with healthy foods and minerals and fish oil that then when you're exposed to assaulting dirty planetary substances, you can rinse them on through you more easily. So women need to be on hormone therapies. Most of us do as we age. We should measure testosterone and consider replacing it if it's low, which is not something that gynecologists do. They'll give you prometrium or an estrogen patch, but they just, unless you say, you know, I'm really horny and my husband's on testosterone and I need to match him or something like that. But even then, they're reluctant to do it. But if you have autoimmune disease, a woman should be considering either a botanical nudge for testosterone or testosterone replacement itself. Males have significantly higher secretory IgA. That's why they have less autoimmune disease. So part of your goal of healing autoimmune disease is helping the patient get more secretory IgA. Well, you've just learned that androgens do that. That's DHEA and testosterone. But you also learned that there's an intimate relationship. Here's secretory IgA and here's the biome. So if the biome is ill, it will harm the secretory IgA and vice versa. So you got to really look at the gut. Anyone with autoimmune disease, the gut is the mothership of their health and their healing. I said exercise increases autoimmune disease. Being a winner increases autoimmune disease, and increases secretory IgA. So one of the reasons mother's milk is so fantastic is that it's high in secretory IgA, which encourages breastfeeding for 6 months to really get the baby's gut started so that it will be able to fight off different steps that would make it vulnerable to autoimmune disease. That's one of the reasons that a baby getting antibiotics in the first year of life, where it damages the secretory IgA, is highly linked to that baby ending up having juvenile autoimmune arthropathy. So for the biggest one being juvenile arthritis, I know that they say for every antibiotic that you start stepping up in that first year, the higher your incidence of severe autoimmune diseases. And a paper came out this week looking at people who have antibodies to gentamicin, and we're given that as an antibiotic to see that there's a higher development of type 1 diabetes down the road. So you want to really do everything you can to protect that baby's gut, especially that first year of life. If you can do it's life-threatening if they don't go on those antibiotics. That's the only time to use them, because that's when they're forming their gut that will fight off autoimmune diseases down the road. And of course, where does a lot of the secretory IgA in mom's milk come from but mother's own biomes, her biome body? That's why we're all one. It's all one. The spiritual leaders would always say we're all one. So how do we treat autoimmune disease? This is like Cliff Notes from A4M. The first thing you do is something that tamps down the inflammation from so much going. The immune system's on overdrive, working wackadoodle overtime. So low dose naltrexone is a under 10 milligrams. A few years ago, it was under 4.5 or 5 milligrams, but it's been broadened a little bit. You, of course, can't be on opioids at the very same time. And I had a patient, we'll call him Dr. M, and his whole family had an autoimmune disease of the gut, ulcerative colitis, and everybody was getting eventually cancers, multiple bleedings, events, and surgeries. He would not give up his chicken steak and his bourbon, and was not somebody, even though he was a doc, to do any of this. Put him on low dose naltrexone, and that was the end of that. He never had another bout of ulcerative colitis again. So tamping down an overactive, I put together in Hormone Balance and Protect, I made that herbal formula to act like an herbal low dose naltrexone to tamp down the overdrive. So you got to have something that will do that, which is either so high dose naltrexones in the ER at 50 milligrams and up, and low dose naltrexone is usually tapered up from 1.5 milligrams per week up to a maintenance dose of 4.5 milligrams. But in some people, it can be twice a day, or you can use botanical formulas, but they've got to be taken twice a day to really get that calming down of the immune system. Then you want to balance the hormones, because remember, progesterone, and I didn't even mention it yet, but estrogen help make those sticky proteins to bring the gut wall back together rather than being leaky. You can give progesterone. It's available from now a lot of different companies over the counter, and to men and to women both, to help protect leaky gut in somebody that's got an autoimmune disease. And you want to make sure there's what have we been talking about? Testosterone to improve the secretory IgA. And you want to look at the biome because of that interaction between the biome and the secretory IgA. You want to give high fish oil, especially at night, because you're healing your gut while you sleep at night. So the last dose of fish oil should be the one that's with dinner. You want to go off the most inflammatory foods. We know at the top of the heap is gluten, and identify any other food reactivities. I like to do delayed IgG and IgM blood sensitivity tests, and you want to really assess digestive players to make sure they're digesting food into small enough pieces, because if the gut is leaky, then large pieces of undigested food cross into the bloodstream and act like debris, turning the immune system on. So you want to tamp down the inflammation, balance the hormones, make sure they're online, make sure the testosterone is in a good place for men and women, or boys and girls all. High dose fish oil at dinner. Some people can handle gluten, but they've published in a study in Nutrients. They took strips of intestinal wall from people who had immunologic reactions to gluten, which is celiac disease, or people who had wheat allergies, or people who said, I have a cast iron stomach and nothing bothers me. All the pasta in the world doesn't bother me. And they mixed strips of intestinal lining from those three categories of patients with gluten, and then measured pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. Everybody got inflammation after gluten, even the people with the cast iron stomachs, everybody. But the people with the cast iron stomachs had brooms. Within a few minutes to 10 minutes, they would make a very powerful anti-inflammatory named interleukin 10. Remember, some are pro-inflammatory and some are anti-inflammatory, and you want to dance harmonic conversions together. So in healthy people, they make really good anti-inflammatory molecules that come in and sweep away, so they can say, I ate it and it didn't bother me. I can eat anything. What's wrong with you? You're such a picky eater. I can't take you anywhere, kind of thing. But other people don't have those same deals. And you're part of our ability to make pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines is the genetic deal of cards. But part of it is the food that we take in, our biomes and our hormones. They all affect this task inside our body. Usually autoimmune issues only show up when they've been brewing for years. This is called early pathogenic autoimmunity. So by the time you're diagnosed, you've had some tissue damage. So there's a spectrum of autoimmunity. And that's why if you've got one autoimmune illness, you just don't want to just only deal with that. You want to get to the root of your issue with all the things that I've been talking about, so you don't find yourself or your patients susceptible to autoimmune issues down the road. So autoantibodies increase in number and type over the years, and then it makes you have more, potentially more autoimmune diseases, because you've never really gone in and healed the gut. And the gut, I have a lot in here, but we only have so much time. I thought this talk was a little bit longer than what we've been giving, and I want to make sure that where's my phone? So I can know what, here it is. So we can have Q&A. So it's already 7:30. Okay, so we're fine. We're almost, okay, I'm going to go through. So invaders that can make your immune system go in overdrive. We've thought of, COVID is a virus, parasites, but endocrine disruptors are now looming as one of the biggest deals. So I am, and people who make less of this anti-inflammatory, where it's a brush clearing out the potential inflammation in the gut, the heavier you are, the less interleukin-10 you make. So you got to lose weight if you're a heavy autoimmune patient. If you have insulin resistance, so you got to do everything that you can. Exercise helps insulin resistance, and also giving nutrients that help make hormones work better, because insulin's a hormone, and also protecting oxytocin, because you just learned that oxytocin has shockingly everything to do with glucose maintenance. I just finished my latest book, and I have an entire chapter on oxytocin and blood sugar maintenance, and also eating disorders. More white fat, less brown fat. So the more you work out, if you have a lot more white fat, brown fat burns fat off, and white fat stores fat, then you make less of that protective interleukin-10, and that all increases your risk of autoimmunity. So Dr. Fasano was the first person to say that leaky gut was part of the etiology, the root cause. He was a pediatric gastroenterologist, and now he's got multiple labs at Harvard and in Philadelphia, and he's an amazing gent. And he said, look at the gut. And he's the one that identified zonulin, which many of you are now measuring. I like to see it be even lower than what a number of the labs are giving us as a reference range, because I don't want, zonulin is a hammer that breaks the enterocytes, the gut cells, apart. So I don't want a lot of zonulin in somebody's body. It elevates when they're fighting things off. Debris is crossing the gut wall. He was the dude that says, heal the gut. If you want to heal autoimmune disease, you have to heal the gut. And now we know that part of bringing the leaky gut that's wide open back together based on hormones. And I'm going to go in here just a little bit. I want you to read through all this. After every single meal, our gut cells open to let supposedly food that's cut up into such small pieces, the body, if they get across into the bloodstream, won't see it as non-self molecules. But all of us have some degree of postprandial bacterial translocation. But people with autoimmune disease have a lot of it. So the other thing you want to do is give them antioxidants, of which I have a lot in my products, or you just can give some extra vitamin C. I like C with bioflavonoids, but I did put it in my product so that, because I wanted to really slow down this deluge of debris into the bloodstream. It's really important in autoimmune patients to slow this leakage of debris across gut walls. So you want to make sure they have good digestion, so they cleave apart the food, and you want to make sure the biome is healthy, and you want to make sure hormones are on board. And you start to see this bigger picture that's all based on physiology and makes a lot of sense. But if you go to regular doctors with a serious health issue and you're diagnosed with a serious autoimmune disease, they don't look at the physiology. They just look at your presenting diagnosis. And it's so this is this is normal enterocytes. These are adhesive proteins. These are all ruled by hormones. So estriol, estradiol, progesterone all make these open and close in the right way. So hormones are part of keeping you well. Endocrine disruptors attack these sticky adhesive proteins. That's why you got to rinse them out of your body. And also you have right here at the base of the enterocytes, you've got your secretory IgA, which then licks out into what gets in between. And a lot of times there'll be infections between here, but remember, this is all maintained by androgens. So we need to know, are young men too low in it? And do they need to have a botanical boost, or they need to get deplasticized? Or what do we need to do to get this working again? And we've got to look at our women with this too. So adhesive proteins, this is a slide that you can look on your own, are dependent on hormones. And as hormones have been disrupted and adhesive proteins have become kind of like today's workers, where they just don't seem like gone with the wind. Frankly, Charlotte, I don't give a damn. That's what many workers seem today. And our adhesive proteins seem to be saying the same thing to us. And that's partially due to the role of endocrine disruptors, weakening our own hormonal signals. And thus, at the tissues that have receptors for them, one that hardly anyone thinks about is adhesive proteins. On one other thing is dendritic cells. Dendritic cells help keep tight junctions. They're the second backup of keeping it. And dendritic cells depend on estriol, especially, and somewhat estradiol to be able to tighten that gut wall. So who would have thunk, part of autoimmunity is leaky gut, partially because endocrine disruptors, because we can't pull our wall back again after the end of a meal. So I'm going to let you read through a lot of this, but there was one or two things that, so we know that you can have lipopolysaccharide, which is found in the cell membranes of some cells in the gut, and they're not supposed to get into the bloodstream, and they're toxic. And when you have a patient with elevated secretory IgA, a lot of times they have elevated LPS. So it turns out that progesterone, which is a pregnancy hormone, because everything opens up in the mom. And so the gut wall starts to open up, and the baby's gut wall could even open up. So progesterone not only progest supports to support just pregnancy, but progesterone was designed by Mother Nature, who never does anything without a purpose, to also tamp down LPS so it won't enter into the body. So who knew slapping on progesterone cream on a man or a woman reduces LPS, which is a critical component to healing autoimmune disease? That is a biggie. I think I'm going to go to Q&A, and then I think when we're off CME, I want to talk just a little bit about how to use my products, because they should be used now on a daily basis to reduce this entourage, in my opinion. I mean, there's nothing else like it to really keep to a minimum of the assault on our hormones. But I think I'm going to leave here and stop my share and go to the chat and look and see if there's questions.
I threw your slides in the chat. If anybody wants to grab the link, it's in the chat and they can pull that and look through.
Okay. There's no questions. So it's completely, should I go on a little bit more? Or
totally
should
up
I?
to you. And if anybody wants to throw a question in the chat or wants to unmute, certainly now's a good time. But if you have a few more minutes, you can go for it in the meantime.
Okay, well, what do you think, guys, of what you just heard? Why don't we get some comments? We don't have as many people here as I thought we would have, but nonetheless. Hi, Jill. What do you think of what I said? How does it maybe change the way you might treat an autoimmune patient? Maybe people are recording or something. They went off to
Gotta
watch.
love Zoom.
You gotta love Zoom. Okay, so we didn't get any response from that. So I just want to go, we need to figure out a way to keep these chemicals out of us. Remember, your brain, we're talking about autoimmunity, so I didn't go so much into the brain, but your brain is mainly made of fat, and you really want to avoid cognitive decline. You want to keep your brain working healthy. So the way you take these products is receptor detox clears off the receptor. It helps get rid of heavy metals, PCBs, plastics, etc., in a unique formula. And you take 2 twice a day for the first bottle, and then you move to the maintenance level ongoing, which is 1 twice a day of receptor detox and 2 twice a day of hormone balance and protect. Hormone balance and protect has multiple levels on which it serves. 1, it acts like a botanical low-dose naltrexone to tamp down the immune system on overdrive. 2, it has a very high dose of boron that lowers that secretory sex hormone binding globulin, so testosterone can be bioavailable to men and women and function well. It also has, between the two, a right amount of daily iodine. All glandular tissue is protected by iodine, and iodine is on every single binding domain. I have all of the transcriptional cofactors in all binding domains, and in the perfect amount between the two of these. But also in hormone balance and protect, I have a botanical formula for controlled growth, because everyone in this country is very worried that hormones drive cancer. I was just Dr. Brownstein's home visiting him and his daughters who are just going into practice with him. They just got out of residency, and they say they've been told hormones drive cancer and not to prescribe them. I mean, that's what they're learning now. So I do have a complete formula in here that works across multiple cancer cell lines to protect them from growing, proliferating out of control, and cancer is really growth out of control. So I think these are a must do all the time. More than anything else, these are safe to take all throughout life. From 5 years old and up, you would just do smaller dosages. You can do it before pregnancy to detox if you wanted to do two twice a day, twice a month with this to really get the detox more aggressive. You can do that. I wouldn't start these products during pregnancy if a woman hadn't been on them before. It's always tweaky to give a woman herbs just in case something doesn't happen, but they're safe. But probably we would not want her to be on hormone balance and protect, which has the herbs in it during the pregnancy. You'd want it before the pregnancy. So I just wanted to go over that with people. And are there any questions? Here's a question. Hi, Holly. Dr. Berkson, I've been following your work and reading your books and have been on your biotics products. I apply much of what I learned from you to my nutritional therapy clients and encourage them to seek out functional medicine-minded doctors to prescribe. Wow about your products. I was going to ask about how long those were okay to take long-term. These are to take long-term. I want to be the most balanced and healthy, hormonally replete corpse in the cemetery unless I get cremated, which is closing in as my age is moving down the tincture of time. But nonetheless, these are something like multis to be taken ongoing. And there's no going off of them. I do believe, because hormones rule the brain, which is why my last book was called Sexy Brain, I do believe that if we're on these products, we'll have a lot more protected cognition, let alone protection against autoimmune disease. And remember, autoimmune disease picks up steam as we age. And if you really want to be careful when you get a colonoscopy, you want to ask the gastroenterologist to do a punch biopsy in several places to rule out microscopic colitis, which is a very common autoimmune disease in the colon, in the small intestine and parts of the colon. And that's where we absorb food. And that's one of the reasons people don't do well with a variety of foods as they age, because their gut gets so sensitive. But you just learned so many different ways that you could protect the gut, which is a big part of staying healthy against autoimmune disease. And I have had patients who were biopsied, identified with microscopic colitis. Then we worked together, and the next time, 3-4 years later, depending on their circumstance, when they got rescoped and had another follow-up biopsy, now they're clear. You can reverse that autoimmune issue in the gut wall, and then they start absorbing more what they take in, and they start becoming a stronger person and rewiring and rewriting their fate. So a lot of medicine is about identifying, we identify this autoimmune disease. We named it, and then they give you biologics, or in a flare, which if you have a severe flare, often you do need a short term of prednisone or something like that. It's all about putting out that fire, which is what low dose naltrexone or this hormonal alternative is supposed to be really good at. The same with high dose fish oil. And you've got to get them immediately off gluten and dairy, and find their other foods, and start using the nutrients to heal the gut wall, and look at hormone health. And while you're looking at hormone health and measuring the hormones in the blood and the binding proteins that they come in on, you want to at the same time get the hormones that you've gotten you working better and better, because a big part of autoimmune disease is hormones under attack or dysfunctional. So if you want to get to root cause of autoimmunity, that has to be part of your treatment consideration. And that's what they can't get anywhere else. There's nowhere to get that. Who knew? I mean, Fasano was the first person to say zonulin hammers the gut wall. Well, I was one of the first people, I think the first person to say adhesive proteins lean on hormones. You need hormones for dendritic action for the adhesive proteins. That's one of the reasons we get more illnesses like pneumonia and viruses, and we're more frail as we're older, because our gut is so wide open, because we have no more hormones to close our gut up. With any severe illness, you get severe leaky gut right away, immediately. So you're in the hospital in the ICU with COVID, and you're just having severe leaky gut. And that's one of the reasons they found that men got COVID more often, but women died from COVID less often, because they had estrogen and progesterone on board, which pulled back that immediate severe leaky gut from a severe virus and healed it faster, quicker. So there was less complications. And they discovered that premenopausal women had the most protection, or menopausal women on hormones. But older women not on hormones had the same incidence of mortality and severity as men did, because they didn't have the hormones on board. But in the research studies, the women that were older on HRT and younger women, they were better. And theoretically, I'm explaining to you, part of the reason is that gut was healed so much faster from the trauma of the severe COVID. So when you start putting this physiology together, it comes alive, and you can think about this on your own. And what worries me with medicine, which I love, I really do love medicine, but it worries me that everyone's so frightened of all the regulation. We've regulated ourselves into a chokehold. And so they don't think. It's all run by algorithms. You have this, as you all know that. But then when you have the problem we have coming down the pike with the planet, which is endocrine disruption and the severe increasing epidemics of so many illnesses, and we just keep throwing the algorithms and pharmaceuticals at them, autoimmune diseases with the multiple names for it included, and we don't get anywhere. So we have to say the buck stops here. We got to say it, and we got to practice it, and we got to translate it, but we got to sound really intelligent when we talk about this with our patients. If you're not intelligent or based in the literature, you can't really make this cogent plea. But it's so important, because our planet is so ill. It's obvious to all of us. And so I really take on that mantle of wanting to be one of the people that help us give hope. I was putting my Christmas package together for my nurse that was my nurse years ago in Palo Alto, and then the cardiologist retired. I worked with them for almost a decade. He was the first functional cardiologist, Dr. Carl Ebnather, in the United States. He closed down the business. I took the whole staff, bought a building in Mountain View, and opened up kind of a replica of that, merging it with what I learned from Dr. Wright's office. We had a Heidelberg gastric analysis machine and chelation and this and that. And then the cardiologist hated being retired, so he knocked on my door and he came back to practice for me. So I worked for him for 10 years, and then he worked for me for 10 years. And we were always about education. We had education rooms. Half the nutrition room showed good labels and half showed bad labels. And I mean, it's a battle because our kids are just so ill. It's shocking. And a lot of it's due to endocrine disruptors, whether it's expressed as autoimmune disease or not. So I hope that you find this information helpful to pass on. I hope that you take this talk and pass it to as many friends as you want. If you've got some OBGYN docs, just, please pass it around to try and get to be part of the solution and also to protect yourself and your loved ones. So I hope this was really helpful for you. Is there any other question? I think people are kind of quiet tonight. They're kind of quiet.
I think that covers it. Thank you for doing this. We love you.
Well, I love you back too, Jesse. Thanks for having me. Okay, everybody, blessings.